Thank you for downloading or watching our sermon. The Canons of Dordt is a product from an international synod held in response to the remonstrant that is vigorously opposing Arminian position. This international synod was held in 1618 to 1619 to answer the 5 points of the remonstrant Arminians. These are the points they compiled in 1610. This synod produced what has come to be known as the 5 points of Calvinism. The acronym is known as TULIP. The confession lists these points as unconditional election, limited atonement, total depravity, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Join us in this series as we work through these 5 heads of doctrine in our study of the Canons of Dordt. When we talk about the Christian life and we talk about assurance, so often we can say, well, maybe assurance isn't that necessary for the Christian life. Maybe I don't really need to be assured that Christ is my Redeemer. In fact, if I doubt that a little bit, maybe I'll be more motivated to conform to the Lord. And so this is basically the old objection that Rome brought against the Reformers. We have the Remonstrants bringing this against the Reformed. That basically, if I am assured of my faith, I'm not going to be motivated to conform to Christ. That's the claim. And if we have no fear of losing our faith or losing Christ, well, then we're just not going to want to be godly or conform to him. That there has to be a little bit of fear, a little bit of terror that's within us. Well, the Canons of Dordt actually takes a different approach. And the canon says, actually, if we don't have assurance, we're not going to conform to Christ. So we shouldn't be depriving people of their Christian assurance. And so how can the Canons of Dordt make this claim when it seems, in terms of common sense or whatever you want to say in our instincts, that if we're too assured, we're going to test the boundaries of grace, versus saying, well, you need assurance to actually want to conform to Christ. And so as we consider this, we'll see first seeking our conformity, and secondly, seeking God's countenance, as we look at these 2 points in Articles 12 and 13. So first, Article 12, just walking through what the Canons of Dordt is teaching us, what it's laying out for us. It's laying out for us that, again, this objection of someone being overassured in their faith is not healthy. And so it lays out this objection even before we get into the objection of errors. That if we're too sure of our faith, we might not want to struggle anymore because we think everything's set. We can end up being proud, and we can end up resting in self instead of the Lord. But secondly, we can be carnally self-assured, the canons addresses. You know, this is, again, the people bringing complaints against the position of assurance. That carnally assured. In other words, we will just be comfortable in sin. We'll say, well, God's my Redeemer. It doesn't really matter if I sin. There's really no motivation, because after all, I have Christ anyway, so why would I want to put off this sin? Now again, these are the objections coming against us. So what is a confession then seeking to clarify? Well, it says that when we really have assurance, we truly know the gospel, it's a root of humility. And I love how it calls it the true root of humility. Because if we really understand the gospel, we know that there's nothing we have done to make ourselves worthy of God's love and affection. We know that it's all God by his mercy that has been bestowed upon us. That's why we have this relationship. So that's why the canon says, if we really understand the gospel, we're really assured of Christ, we have the assurance that there's nothing I've done to make myself worthy of God's mercy. A childlike respect. Again, this is that childlike faith where Christ exhorts us to be like a child, having the confidence that our Lord will provide for us, care for us, lead us, see to it that all our needs are met. It's that childlike respect of looking up to a father, where ideally when a child's young enough, the father can do no wrong, the father is perfect, etc. That's sort of the mindset that we're looking at God from this perspective. And then it says a genuine godliness. Now this qualification is important, because the Canons of Dordt, when it says genuine godliness, is what we'll get into in a moment with the Apostle Paul. This means that we're truly resting in Christ. First and foremost, it means that we also want to conform from the heart. It's not just outward actions. It's not just acting the part. And so when the Canons is saying this, it wants us to understand that we're doing this in the power of the Spirit. We are those who are not doing this in the confidence or in the works of the flesh. We truly want to conform to the Lord. So this genuine godliness is starting in terms of our repentance with a true godly sorrow. That is, we understand we offend God in our sins, versus that we just don't want to get caught or look bad before man. It tells us then that if we have this assurance, there's an endurance in every conflict. Now this is just reminding us in terms of the seasons of life. Could be a struggle in sin, could be a trial that God has set before us and is leading us through. And it's saying that when you truly understand who God is, you will believe that the Good Shepherd will lead us through the valley of the shadow of death, using Psalm 23. Not going to lead us around it, not going to avoid it, but he's going to lead us through it. He will bring us there. It says when you have a true assurance, you have fervent prayers. In other words, it's not, again, just going through the motions of, I guess it's proper to pray now, or maybe I should pray about this, and that's probably a good idea. But a fervent prayer is saying that we really have confidence that God hears our prayers for the sake of Christ. It's having that confidence of his steadfast mercy, his love, his compassion being shown to us. And then it uses the language of steadfastness and cross-bearing. This is using the language of the Gospels. Again, it's confessing that truth, that cross-bearing understanding that we suffer on account of Christ, and that we have steadfastness in this because we know that God is doing something through this, whatever it may be. God is at work within us. We have that confidence. And so when we have this assurance, we don't immediately turn and say, God's turned his face on me, or God doesn't love me, or I've done something for whatever reason that God is bringing this to me. We simply go to the end of Job, where the Lord brings Job to a place where Job understands, okay, I don't understand who you are. Your working is far bigger and greater than my comprehension. I will just trust you. That's sort of the mindset that the Canons of Dordt is getting at, that we have that steadfastness, that consistency. Even when we may not understand what we're going through, we know that God will lead us through it. And then there is a well-founded joy in God. I love this wording, because it's shifting our perspective to a heavenly focus, that we move to the understanding that our God will finish what he has started. And so when we think about these things in terms of our orientation of assurance, the canons or this article goes on to speak about the positive things. When we reflect, so again, this is contemplating, thinking about the promises of God, his steadfast mercy, his steadfast love, promises of the covenant of grace, who Christ is, a reminder that we're a people who are made worthy in Christ Jesus. And then it says, is the incentive to a serious and continual practice of thanksgiving and good works. So this is basically taking what the Heidelberg Catechism says in the third section of living out of gratitude, that we want to live unto God because of what he has done. And so we're not going to push the boundaries of God's grace. We're going to contemplate the richness of who he is and say, okay, God is the one who has redeemed. God is the one who has made me alive. I want to live for him as his disciple, being one who is faithful unto him, not because Christ's work is lacking in any way, but because I want to do this out of joy, out of a reverence, out of an awe for who he is, based upon the testimony of Scripture, the examples of the saints. And so when you put these two together, you can think of, for example, Hebrews 11, where you see the saints who have endured many things. Now, if you take Hebrews 11, you see the beginning of it, basically verses 1 through 4, roughly in Hebrews 11, where you have the Lord creating something, and his creation, we don't see the actual act of the creation, but we see the result of it. And so what's the point of that faith? It's not what they have done or their faithfulness. It's actually the Lord, in the power of his Spirit, has cultivated such a life in these saints that as they're recreated, they're oriented to heaven. And so the proof that the author of Hebrews is giving us is that in the context of this passage, these saints are those who are manifesting the recreated power of God. They're willing to suffer with a focus and orientation of who they are in the Lord. And so this already here establishes a point. Hebrews 11, these saints are willing to suffer consciously because they are assured of the promises of the gospel. They see the bigger picture of life and say there's something far beyond myself. But nevertheless, as we look at our passage to establish this point, we turn to 2 Corinthians 7. And as we consider 2 Corinthians 7, Paul, as he writes to the Corinthian church, you remember this is where Paul is addressing the issue of this church desiring the super apostles. 2 Corinthians 11, he seems to develop this, or basically bring his argument to the point of where he's going. And so in 2 Corinthians, he's dealing with a lot of things going on in this church. So we have 1 Corinthians, there's division, there's immorality, there's all sorts of things going on. And so the second letter that Paul's writing to the church is Paul establishing his apostolic credentials, reminding them, listen, I'm an apostle, I'm duly called by Christ, I'm doing this to bring the revelation of God unto you. So as Paul's doing this, he's reminding the Corinthian church of who he is. Now in our section, as I mentioned, basically 6 through 13 that we're looking at, we have the Apostle Paul recounting a harsh letter, a letter that grieved the church, and Paul's one who actually had a little bit of grief or sorrow in writing this letter. It's a strong letter that he wrote. Now in terms of what this letter is, some say it's 1 Corinthians, others say it's a lost letter. I personally would argue it's a lost letter that the Lord in his providence never preserved because there was no reason to it. Looking at the evidence here in 1 Corinthians 7 with Paul being grieved, addressing an individual, it seems that it's a very specific letter addressing specific things that 1 Corinthians isn't as specific. And so I'd argue that it's a letter that Paul wrote to this church. In God's providence, he never preserved the letter. It wasn't something that basically was edifying or necessary for the church universal, but it was something for this particular congregation. And so when we have that backdrop of this letter where Paul writes to them, he has this grief, he has this understanding that he has the sorrow and that this church engages in this godly sorrow. And so Paul, while he's conflicted about writing this letter, has this celebration that there's this outcome. Now when we talk about this section, as I mentioned in verse 6 and verse 13, you notice that in verse 6 there's a lot of mention about the God who comforts, the God who has comforted us. Verse 13, he picks up Titus again, and he talks about the comforting of God. So as I've mentioned, this is this inclusio. It's sort of taking a section of 2 Corinthians 7 that Paul wants us to understand this section coming to us as a purpose for who God is and what he has done. And so in terms of this, when Paul says this comfort of Titus who has come to them, we might say, well, is Titus the one who's the ultimate comforter? Well, it seems that's probably something that's true, but he's a comforter for a particular reason. That when Titus came to them, he reported on the reception of this letter. There is zeal, there's mourning that has happened within this church, and the Apostle Paul is celebrating the reality that something has changed within this congregation, that the letter he wrote to them had a desired effect. And so while Paul himself may be a little bit conflicted about whether or not he wanted to send this letter or write this letter, he's assuring them that he took no pleasure in doing this. He's not a sadist. He doesn't want to see them suffer. He doesn't enjoy that. He just wanted them to know that when he wrote it, the tone of it was harsh. Paul affirms that. And as the tone was harsh, he's happy that something came about. So Paul, again, it's not that Paul's conflicted. Paul addresses this earlier in 2 Corinthians, that he's not yes and no at the same time. He's a man who moves in deliberate action for the glory of God. And so the writing of this letter in terms of this conflict is just, do I write something so harsh? I feel kind of bad writing something so harsh, but yet it needs to be said. And so Paul does it, and he writes the letter. And we find that there is a contrast of grief, and it's an important reaction. Because in verse 10, he speaks of a godly grief and a worldly grief. Now, the importance of this is that when we look at this, as Paul desires that they don't suffer, he celebrates the reaction of this. A godly grief is a grief that cuts straight to the heart. When we talk about changing or repenting, it truly is literally a changing of one's mind, or a changing of one's mindset is literally what the word means. But it's not just that someone has to be persuaded. Repenting is being persuaded in such a way that one changes their course, their trajectory of life. So it's something that's radically different within them. And that's what the godly sorrow produces. It doesn't just produce a change in action or a persuasion. It's changing one's whole orientation and focus. One is cut to the heart. And so this change of mind, this change of action, is where someone, by the power of the Spirit, recognizes, oh my goodness, I keep going down this road. This is not going to end well. They're cut to the heart. They want their direction, their orientation to change. The contrast of this is a worldly sorrow. Worldly sorrow is where we may have done something illegal and we think, my goodness, if I get caught for this, I might end up in prison or jail. I hope I don't get caught for this. There isn't really a consciousness that I've offended God, or a consciousness this is contrary to his will. It's more of, I want to change my course of action because I don't want the consequence of prison. So in terms of the outward action, it might look the same. But the Apostle Paul is saying clearly, when he looks at this, he can tell that there's a godly sorrow. It's a godly sorrow that leads to life versus death. That's the contrast that Paul's saying. That he says, while I was conflicted of writing such a harsh letter, I see how the Lord used that letter and that you were actually changed from the core. So what we see then, as we see the Spirit working in the context of this church, we find that this is an action or a change in course where one turns their life, turns their direction, turns their whole focus and orientation away from self and unto the Lord, a conforming unto God. This is what the Canons of Dordt is getting at with the essence of this type of godly sorrow, this movement to want to move to the Lord. You're understanding who he is. Now, in terms of what this means to truly live this out, we speak of seeking God's countenance. That's seeking God's face, seeking his approval. Article 13, the Canons of Dordt, very briefly, reminds us in Head 5 that if we push the boundaries of God's grace, or as we have seen in Article 4, that if we push the boundaries of God's grace, God may give us exactly what we want. And so Article 13 is now building on Article 12, but also recalling Article 4. So if you notice the language in Article 13, it speaks of the one who has been restored. So Article 4 is the Lord handing an individual over to sin, saying, okay, this is what you want. You desire this. Here you go. I'm going to remove my restraint. You can pursue whatever you want, and you can wallow in the mud, basically. Article 13 is now saying, okay, what do we do with this individual that as we go through the following articles, that the Lord will at some point work this godly sorrow. There will be a change in orientation. An individual will say, no, I want to live for Christ. I don't want to go down this course. And the Lord's the one who's pulling them up from this. So now Article 13 is dealing with the reality of, okay, the temptation is to say, well, the person got a taste of sin, therefore the person's going to want to go back to sin if we give this person too much assurance. Article 13 is saying, actually, this individual who's experienced the sin, this fall from grace, and was handed over to their sin, that the Lord is the one who's actually working in them in such a way that they don't want to return to it. So we don't want to take these people and say, well, we want to deprive you of the promises of the gospel. We want to deprive you the promises of Christ. We just want to just continually have this continually remind you that if we give you too much grace or too much comfort, you're just going to move over and give in to this once again. The Canons of Dordt says actually we need to continue to be refreshed and to be reoriented and refocused in the promises of God. This is a reminder of what the Canons is saying, that we have to remind even the individual who fell into deep, grievous sin, whatever it may be completely kicked out of the church, like 1 Corinthians 5, and now they've been brought back. It's that reminder that this individual also should have assurance and assurance of faith. And so how do we do this? Well, this is where we return back to this notion of godly sorrow and the result of this. That godly sorrow is what brings us back to life. It changes us at the very core. And as it changes us, we have fundamentally different motivations. Worldly sorrow leads to death, as I've mentioned. It's not changing one's course or one's actions for the glory of God. Changing one's course and actions because one does not want to get caught or experience the consequence of their sin. And so they change their course, not to please the living God. So now we say, okay, so we understand this, but then how does this godly sorrow manifest itself? How do we know that assurance has something to do with this? Well, if we look at this in terms of what the Apostle Paul lays out in verses 11 through 13 as he builds on this, we have this eagerness, this earnestness. So now when we have this earnestness, this can be good or bad in Scripture. It's basically an intense desire of wanting to do something intensely. So earnestness could be wanting to intensely pursue sin. Earnestness could be wanting to intensely pursue God. So in verse 11, we have this earnestness that this godly grief has produced. We find that it's not that they want to pursue sin, but as they recognize a promise of the gospel, they want to pursue God. They understand that not all is lost, that they can truly pursue the Lord and find life in the Lord, that they want to conform to him, seek his face, bring glory to his name as his disciples. And so when we think about what the Apostle Paul has laid out as his church is struggling with his apostolic ministry, as Paul writes to them, he's one who writes to the one who has suffered. Now again, when we say this one who suffered wrong, in verse 12, this is something that's also conflicted. So we have this change of heart, we have this movement. So Paul writes to the church regarding the one who's done wrong. Now again, as you can imagine, this is something that's debated. Some say this is 1 Corinthians 5:5, of the individual has the immoral relationship, and this individual is to be put out of the church. Some say it's 1 Corinthians 6, where you have an individual conducting a lawsuit, but 1 Corinthians 6 doesn't seem that it's dealing specifically with an individual, but rather there's a systematic problem in the church. But if you look at 2 Corinthians 2, verses 5 through 8, it seems that there was someone who challenged Paul and challenged his apostolic ministry. So the harsh letter was probably addressing that individual along with other things. So now in verse 12, when he writes for the one who did wrong and why the Apostle Paul is one who's conflicted on this, he sees that now this individual is earnest to come back to the Apostle Paul. So it makes sense that this maybe or probably was some agitator in the church doubting the apostolic ministry of Paul, and now they want to come back to the Apostle Paul, which is good, because Paul, the apostle, isn't just a man, he's the one who brings a revelation of God. As he brings a revelation of God, denying his apostolic letters and his apostolic authority is denying God himself or the gospel. That's a big deal. And so when the Apostle Paul is excited about this godly transformation, that the individual now says, oh my goodness, I want to come back, I want to be restored, I want to find the grace of God in this. This is why we can find now in verses 6 and 13 the comforting words from Titus. When Titus gives this report, they are comforted. Why? because the gospel has shown its power. As Paul writes this letter, an individual is moved from being content to dwell in sin, from one who now wants to conform to Christ, bring glory to the Lord. So it's not just that Titus is a wordsmith or has a particular giftedness with language, and maybe that's possible. But it's also that Titus gives a report. It's Paul calling attention to the substance of this report. But now when we think about this language in verses 6 and 13 regarding this comfort, again, this section, the Apostle Paul being encouraged, godly sorrow, moving one back to pursue the Lord, we say, but what about the comforted? What does this really mean? Well, first, we think about this comforting. In Scripture, we think in the Old Testament, the one who is comforted is the one who has a mourning that's overturned, not mourning in the sense of the first light of the day, but mourning in the sense of sorrow and grief. It could be mourning in the evening. What are my enemies going to do to me tomorrow? We can read that in the Psalms. And then there's a day, and then there's the overturning of that. But examples of this is Isaiah 49:13. God is the one who comforts, encourages the outcast. And so this comfort is the Apostle Paul saying to the church, listen, God is a God of comfort. He is a God of peace. We have in Isaiah 51:3, where you have Zion laid to waste. What's the promise that Isaiah gives? That the Lord is the one who's going to overturn. He will bring his comfort to Zion. His steadfast love, his mercy will be manifested. Again, Psalm 23:4, the rod and the staff of the Lord comforts me. Why? Because the Lord is a protector, the one who is a shield and defender who goes before his people. We think about that fundamental promise, which is important, and what the Canons of Dordt is establishing. When we think about that promise and we're assured of this, we say, no, my God is my shield and defender. He comforts me. He watches over me. Now, when you think about God in Paul's letter here, Paul begins by describing God. He is the one who comforts us. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 4. This is a God of all mercies, the God who manifests himself as a merciful God. So the Apostle Paul, in taking verses 6 through 13, is not denying assurance to this church, even as this church is essentially on the verge of denying the gospel, apostatizing, turning away from Christ. Because they're saying, we don't want Paul's message of the gospel, we want the super apostles' message of the gospel. Paul's not an apostle we accept, we want the super apostles to be the ones. And so when Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians 7, calling to our attention verses 6 through 13, he's saying, well, I'm comforted. You're comforted. Why? Because this letter I was conflicted about resulted in you once again finding your comfort in God. The God at the beginning of the letter, the God of all mercies. 1 verse 3, the God of all comfort. So when Paul writes this letter, he's starting with who God is, the assurance of God, the promises of God, everything that is based in God and what he has done. And so it's important as we look at this, we find this church that really is on the verge of apostasy, turning away from the gospel, turning away from the apostolic witness, a serious, serious state, that the Apostle Paul does not deprive them of the rich goodness of the gospel. He wants them to understand this is who God is, the God who overturns our circumstances, the God of all comfort, the God who manifests his mercy and his steadfast love by being the shield and defender of his people. And so Paul, when he writes this and calls them to account, it's not a hypothetical thing that if you do this, you can experience this comfort. If you do this, maybe God will be pleased with you. It's no. This is who God is. Turn to this Lord. He is a God of comfort and grace. Find your life and identity in him. Just lastly, hopefully the kids remember the one thing I said. If you forget everything else in catechism for the whole year, remember this one thing. And the one thing was when I talked about the indicative and the imperative. That's what Paul's doing here. He's speaking of, this is who you are in Christ Jesus. This is your life. This is your identity. Therefore, live for Christ. So in terms of our introspection, in terms of our moving to godly sorrow, we don't just rush right into the sins. We have to start where the Apostle Paul exhorts us to start. The God of all comfort. The God who has overturned my circumstances. The God who has brought me near to him by his choosing, by his action, by his grace, by his mercy. Then we look within ourselves and say, this is not consistent with who I am in Christ. This needs to be put to death. This needs to be brought in line. And as we do that, we're not doing this to attain the favor of God, but we're doing this because we truly want to pursue the face of our God for his honor, for his glory, and by his grace and mercy. We're not doing this to prove our worthiness. We're doing this in the confidence that Christ has made us worthy, and therefore we want to walk as disciples of Christ out of gratitude, which is exactly what the Canons of Dordt is teaching us. We don't want to be deprived of our assurance so that we try harder. We're actually going to have greater problems if we just try harder. If we don't start with the understanding as to how we enter into this relationship, we will not have the confidence to put to death the sins within us, to struggle to conform unto him, and to live out of gratitude for his glory. And so in conclusion then, if we're called to conform to Christ as a people made alive in the Lord, why would we want this? Why would we want this assurance? What does this conformity look like? Well, this conformity is the assurance that our God is a God of all comfort. That's what Paul puts in this section. Calls their attention, yep, I wrote the harsh letter. I was conflicted about it. Didn't know if I should have been so harsh, but you know what? I'm glad I did it because the Lord used it. You've moved to godly sorrow. It's not now that you've moved to godly sorrow, let's see if maybe you're worthy of the Lord's comfort. No, the section here, comfort, comfort. The Lord is the one of all comfort. As he began the letter, he's beginning with assurance and calling us then to walk in the confidence of Christ. The call then is not that we want to test the boundaries of grace. That's not even what Paul's saying. He's saying as we understand the God of all comfort, we want to conform to this Lord, living unto him, doing so, as I love the language of our catechism, putting it so well in the third section, out of gratitude. Not merely out of obligation, which is true. We are obligated to obey God, obviously. He is God, we are his creation. But we do it out of gratitude because we have been redeemed and made alive in Christ. So let us then see ourselves as ones who have to die to self and live unto Christ. But not doing this so we may attain assurance, but doing this because we have Christ. We have the blessings of the gospel. Let us then, in the blessings of the gospel, move forward out of true joy that we are his redeemed, seeking to die to self in the power of the Spirit as we are made alive in our Lord. Amen. Thank you for watching or listening to our podcast. Belgrade URC is a Bible-believing Reformed confessional church that seeks to cultivate community around our Savior. If you desire to learn more about Christianity, please join us for worship each Sunday at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. If you're not able to attend church, you can tune in to our Sunday live stream through our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our current sermon series and weekly meditation through iTunes or your favorite podcast catcher. If we are not listed on your favorite podcasting host, please let us know through our webpage, urcbelgrade.com. You can also utilize our archive sermon series on our website, urcbelgrade.com. Most of all, we hope to see you sojourning and fellowshipping with us each Sunday. Until we meet again, may the Lord's blessing and peace be upon you.